Welcome along to this special event as part of the Dublin Book Festival 2021. I am genuinely thrilled to be talking today to the author of the award-winning and the international booker shortlisted When We Cease to Understand the World. From his home in Chile, Benjamin Labatut. How are you?
Hello, Rick. Thank you. And hello to everybody out there.
Thanks so much for joining us at this year's festival. Before we start to talk about the book, or before I move on to that, I'm going to maybe talk to you a little bit about you and becoming a writer, about how that happens to you in your life, at what point that happens, and where.
Well, that's a difficult question. I think I took it a little bit too seriously. To this day, I have this fantasy that becoming a writer actually requires a becoming of sorts. I always thought that you would have to have a different mind. You would have to sort of put yourself through an ordeal. And the practical effect of all of that is that it took me a very long time to get started, and that I put myself through a lot of silly, perhaps even slightly hazardous things now. And when I finally said, okay, I'll do this, I had the good fortune of meeting a teacher, a real master of sorts, wild old man, a Chilean poet who was by then dying, but he had all my friends had gone to do workshops at his home, and I was too old for that. I was old already to begin, and he was a couple of years away from death. And so I started going to his house, and I sort of told him my life, and I hadn't written anything, which is strange now, to be like 25 years old and not have written a word. And he heard me and he said, well, your problem is that you're a writer. And that sort of, he baptized me, and we started working together. And he never got to see my first book published. He died a little bit before that. And after he did, I found out that he wasn't the man I thought he was. He had been several different men. He'd been heterosexual and homosexual. He'd been married, unmarried. He had this plurality of sorts, and that had a really big effect on me. I sort of said, okay, so, and he never published anything. He didn't publish a word. So at least to me, I believe that in his dingy, dirty, smelly apartment, I sort of got to touch something like the secret heart of literature. And that was, his name is Samir Nasal. And I owe him almost everything that's happened since.
Do you think if you hadn't encountered him, and if your two paths hadn't crossed, that maybe even to this point today, you still wouldn't have written anything?
That's a possibility, yes, because I have a natural resistance. Even though I write, I've gone through periods, very long ones, where I haven't written a word, years. And I even went through a period where I couldn't read, because I was sort of messing with my mind in many ways, trying to elicit this infantile fantasy of that you had to become strange yourself, that you had to, because I have this outsized admiration for, and you can tell in the book now, I am seduced by the idea of otherworldly geniuses. So when you come up against people like Borges or Bolaño or Dylan, I just said, I sort of said, okay, so you have to really become strange yourself. And I did everything I could now. Both, I think people know what I'm talking about, because a lot of people do this. And I do believe that while it's very silly and naive, you really do have to put yourself through you have to jump through some hoops if life hasn't already made your circumstances transformative enough.
I think I know what you mean. I think I felt that way the first time I ever heard a Tom Waits album. I had that moment of going, "You've got to be Tom Waits in order to write anything that feels that way." Tell us maybe a little bit as well about you yourself and about where you come from, because you weren't born in Chile. You've lived in a number of different places before you've ended up being where you are. Maybe just tell us a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Well, since I'm talking to Dublin, I think the most relevant thing in my entire biography is that I was uprooted. I was born in the Netherlands, came back to Chile, and then went back to the Netherlands. But I went to a British school. So all my friends, my mates were from Scotland and Wales and from all over really. It was an international school. And what happened is that it sort of replaced, English sort of replaced Spanish inside my head. I grew up watching Bottom and reading Red Dwarf. You know, it was the young ones. It was so when I came back to Chile, it just didn't feel like home at all. It wasn't the country, and well, it was a horror too. No, we had the dictatorship when I was young. So basically, I would say it was just that. It was this displacement and living in the Netherlands but not speaking Dutch, reading in English while talking in Spanish. It's that's really it. My life is incredibly boring.
We're at quite a remove from it here, so maybe you could tell us a little bit about contemporary Chilean writing and what the writing scene is like where you are.
Oh, I couldn't. I have no idea. I don't read them at all. I've always thought that you should stay away from people who are working next to you. And I read most of the authors I read are dead or dying, or and so my references are really not Chilean at all. So no, I really can't talk about that. I don't like that. I've never understood, no, because with art and literature in particular, you have the world. It's there. It's the entire world, and you should develop your own resonances. No, I'm obsessed with Alan Moore. I steal from Adam Curtis. He's probably one of my biggest influences. And I talk to people here. Of course, a lot of my friends, they know Adam Curtis. They've seen his documentaries. But I was like, when people they would say, "Oh, I really like this part of your book," and I said, "Well, I stole that from Curtis." And then and I got in touch with him now, since I use sort of the Booker. My idea of success is getting an email from the people that you admire. That is just that to me means the world. And he invited me to have a cup of coffee or tea, probably tea. And so my references are really not Chilean at all. I couldn't tell you what's going on here. I frankly don't care.
I think it's a great definition of success, managing to contact those people whose work you love. Tell me then about the book, and tell me about the genesis of it, and tell me where the idea starts that then ends up becoming the book.
Well, the main thing is it comes from a personal obsession with unknowability, with ideas and experiences that nobody can get their heads around. I didn't sit down and said, I'm going to write this book. I just have a previous obsession with abysmal matters. And so you keep running into stories that are sort of on that wavelength. And I worked in all the texts in parallel, and they start feeding on each other. The first text that I wrote them all at the same time. That's an important thing. So the first essay, I was, again, no, Adam Curtis. I had these notes on cyanide, and I just, the book I wrote before came out of a harrowing personal experience where I sort of started looking into the parts of the world that we don't understand. And that led me down to just random, and I started stringing these ideas in the text that became Prussian Blue. But I didn't plan it out before. I just picked a thread, which in this case was cyanide, because I had a couple of interesting facts about it that are not in the text. Like, it covers the crust of Halley's Comet, and it's a possible precursor to the amino acids that then become DNA. So I thought, oh, well, this is wonderful because it's life and death in the same molecule. And I followed that. And then I started bumping into these other stories, but what they have in common, the discovery of the black hole, the two separate formulations of quantum mechanics, the ideas of Mochizuki and Grothendieck, they're all basically, what they share is this, that they sort of exceed our capacity for understanding. There are things that the mind has discovered, but that the human mind doesn't seem to be built to withstand or to probably understand. So it came together that way. And it was very, there's a lot of coincidence. I think if you know what you're doing, you're probably not going to do anything worthwhile. And I was very lucky in that sense, that it came together in a coherent, semi-coherent form. But you can tell if you look at it that it's a weird essay, and then it's two weird short stories and a novella, and then it ends with this semi-autobiographical piece. So you can tell that it's a hopscotch. It's all put together in weird ways.
I very much like the idea of you pulling at a thread. That makes complete sense to me as somebody who's read the book quite recently. Tell me maybe a little bit about the first story, about Prussian Blue and about Fritz Haber, because his story, and I think it's the one that since I've read it and when I've been talking to other people about the book, his is the story that I've kind of started with, because he is the man, as you say in the book, who not only saves potentially millions or hundreds of millions of lives, but then also costs the life of millions as well. That's an extraordinary story.
I think one of the things that literature is good at is showing these contradictions. That's the main thing. No, I think the richness of paradox is something that really only the liberal arts can deal with. And Fritz Haber's figure, again, I ran into him by accident. I was studying Prussian Blue, and I came to find out that they had distilled cyanide, and cyanide is this wonderful poison. It's been used by so many artists and scientists and to kill themselves with, because it's so fast acting. And then I got to Fritz Haber, and then you sort of, he's a larger than life, he's a titan. And I had bumped into him while researching other scientists, because he was revered at the time. He was like, for example, John von Neumann, who's this Hungarian mathematician I'm obsessed with. His father basically forced him to study chemistry because of Haber. He said, like, no, you got to be like Haber. They were both, they came from Jewish descent. And then I bump into this man, and he sort of represents what I am most fascinated with it, which is this idea of death and life touching hands, no, the dark and the lights. And that text is like a little bit of a spider's web, where you if you look at it in the morning, it's covered in dew and it's very beautiful. No, if you run to it at night, you can bump into the spider that's in the middle of the web waiting for you. And it's not Fritz Haber and the many scientists and the things that I write about, they shouldn't be easily classifiable. How would you judge it? Would you judge him for his murderous intent? Would you judge him for the way that he basically drove his wife, who was the first woman to get a doctorate in chemistry, to suicide because of how, or do we judge him because of the fact that we get to eat because of the way he fixed nitrogen? These are not easy things to think about, and the book is really trying to get people into that state where they're not they are unsure. Uncertainty is at the heart of this.
And the Carl Schwarzschild story interests me too, because I'm an amateur reader of subjects, and I encounter a couple of books every year on everything from uncertainty to quantum physics. I think I have some small vague handle as much as the next man in the street, but the story about him and his connection to Einstein is something that I'd never come across before.
Yeah, I lucked out. I was listening to this talk by Brian Greene on string theory, and he just mentioned it in passing. No, I think he just said there's Einstein's first exact solution was made by this lieutenant who was dying in the Second World War. And I said, what do you mean? That's a story, no? And then you find that there's not much information about this, but then you have to dive down into papers and proceedings of academia, and I found this figure who was, again, in his time, he was a superstar. He was an astronomer, but he was mathematically very, he had this mind for mathematics. And I started researching. What I like the most about his story are two things. One of them is this ideas made flesh. The fact that his was the first mind to mathematically touch a black hole. And at the same time, he is in the black hole of war. He's fighting right there in the trenches. And his body is covered in a blistering, necrotizing disease. So to me, there's a strange process by which ideas, strange, otherworldly ideas, become incarnate. And that's when they're dangerous. Because ideas that are not tied to flesh are easy to ignore. While if you get a, ignorant carpenter who suddenly becomes infected by God, we all get nailed to that cross, no? So when this twin happenings, they have to occur at the same time. Strange ideas have to become flesh, they have to become pain, so that we feel them, so that we get a sense of them. And I try to do that in the book. I try to get people, and because I suffer from skin diseases myself, so I'm drawn to these things. And the other thing that I really like about that book, that story, is that, and this is something that you perhaps know from your own reading, his solution of these equations, the fact that our black hole exists is both a confirmation of the validity of Einstein's general relativity, and it negates it at the same time, because the equations simply break down at a point, at the singularity. And that is what I'm always trying to get at, these paradoxes where you confirm and deny. And that's when you start thinking, really.
And it is, as you allude to in the book, the deeply scary and the deeply unknowable. This point is that's where it occurs. Maybe just tell me a little bit about the research for this, in terms of, as you said, once you start pulling strings, you find something and then you end up somewhere else and somewhere else and somewhere else. How was that for you? And was there a point at which you had to put everything to one side and go, I think I've done enough of this research? I've spoken to more than my fair share of authors who over the course of time have gotten lost down the research rabbit hole and then started to neglect the actual writing that they needed to do at the end of that.
Yeah, that's true. It's just that research is that's when you as a writer are learning. That's the most enjoyable part. I'm a journalist by training, so I enjoy research. I like to consume massive amounts of information. I think that's where beauty is to be found, especially now in the modern world. And I think it's a certain skill that is needed more than ever. The capacity to find these rare germs amidst the noise. But you have to have a feeling for it, and you have to have the delight in just finding these things out, dredging things from the past. It's just, to me, it's the joy of writing. I don't like the writing part as much. And actually, I get always, my first drafts are usually strict nonfiction, because to my mind, that should be enough. But it's not. It's not enough, because fiction adds an important layer, which is meaning. And the meaning actually comes from the telling of the story. The meaning is not in the story itself. It's not in the facts. It's not in the research. So there's two parts to it. No, first is you find the story. You say, okay, this is what I'm interested in. And you try to dive as deep as you can, and you try to build that up and make it as strong as you can. But then there's a giant extra step, which is where you say, okay, now I'm going to betray reality. Now I'm going to make things up and distort and lie, because you're sacrificing truth for something that is more important, which is meaning. Meaning is more important than truth. And you do that as a writer, knowing that it's going to bother people, knowing that that's where you start to come into the text. And that's the embarrassing part, because you can tell very clearly what my obsessions are, and you can see it in the text, and I hate that. It's like it bores me. My ideas bore me. I already know them. I'm sick of them. I can't. These are obsessions that I've carried and that I will carry probably for the rest of my life. But well, maybe there's some worth there, but not to me. But then my agent who helps me write, Constanza Martinez, she's a wonderful, she'd be like, listen, you're a writer. You have to write, make something up. This is boring or it's not enough. So we go back and forth, and then I capitulate, and then I sit down and I rewrite, and then I rewrite, and then I distort things to the point where I guess things become as complex as they should be. It mirrors the complexity of the real world. The problem with nonfiction is that it's not mysterious enough. It doesn't have enough darkness in it. You need to add these layers of shadow for people to see farther. And I think that's what this mix, and while it retains some of the gloss and it retains registers from the investigation, which make it enjoyable and worthwhile, no? And still, the most amazing things in the book, they are mostly real. They're mostly real.
Let me ask you two questions off the back of that then. One of which is, and I've seen you talk about this in a couple of other locations. So the book is mostly real, as you say yourself. There are elements of fiction that have occurred in various places. And you talk about it in the afterword in the book as well. About how much of each story is there? Did you choose in each story that each of it needed a little something in order to get it to that place that you wanted to as a writer, or how did that work for you when you were in the process of writing it?
Well, I think you follow reality as far as it will take you, and if you are content with going that far, well, you can stop there. But I'm usually not. No, I'm like the kid who always wants to go a little further down the tunnel. And eventually you get to a place down the tunnel where it's just completely dark, and your matches go out and you're left there. And that's when the things that I am most interested come out at you, You feel the tentacles of the imagination. And that is really, those deranged landscapes are the ones that fiction or that literature deals with, because we don't have any other tools for that. You can try and get at it through psychology or certain parts of science, but fiction really is a very, very ancient tool. It's a way that we have developed as human beings, as animals, to deal with this massive thing that we have growing inside our heads. So what I do is I just go as far as I can, but if I want to reach a deeper meaning, only fiction can do that. Only the imagination can take that extra step. And we shouldn't forget that that is actually what I would consider the most human world. We need these fictions. We need that extra layer. We need the flavor that art gives, that imagination gives. And without it, when you try to separate it, everybody loses. We become just, it's as if I thought, well, if I took Roald Dahl from my childhood, if I took him away and I just read history, if I hadn't read Going Solo and I'd read some account of what it's like to be a fighter pilot, my life would have been really almost worthless. So the mixing, while I am fascinated by the forms of the world and by history, I am doubly fascinated by our inner worlds, which is much more complex and darker, and you can't put a pin in it. You can't fix it. Truth and in a sense, it can be quite boring.
Was there ever a point for you when you were in the process of writing this where you ended up down one of those deep, dark caves and you felt like you had to reverse?
No, that's silly. That's just a cultural. It's a cultural backlash at the moment where people feel that we need to get back to the real world. No, I I don't think we have to do that at all. I think we have to develop a better sense for the madness of the world. We have to learn from paranoia. We have to go back to Philip K. Dick. We have to listen to these because there's no getting back to the real world. I don't think there ever was. That the whole point of the book is to use these texts to just point people to the simple fact that things are stranger than they think. Even matter does not behave in these perfectly reasonable ways. So no, I don't think you can go too far as long as you're honest about it. And I want to be very clear, this is a work of fiction. This is a work of through and through. I think that even if you add a couple of lines of fiction to something, that it immediately infects everything, it changes everything. And you can tell there's a single paragraph of fiction in the first text, and from there it blooms. And even though I know people, and I know I'm not stupid, I know that's the best text of the book, and that it's the one that people enjoy the most. But it's a horror that we already know. We know about the Holocaust. We know about the Nazis. We know what poison does to a dying dog. We've seen it, you know? But what happens with the things that we can't see, or that we can't imagine, or that exceed us? And unless you're willing and able to go to have a career in science and to peer very deeply through the language of mathematics into the black hole, you're going to need fiction if you want to see farther.
It's also an interpretive tool, isn't it? In that you're right. If you want to delve into many of the areas and worlds that you talk about in this book and that many of your characters are dealing with as a scientist, that's something that, given the complexity of it, makes it pretty much inaccessible to almost everybody who is attempting to read books. But whereas fiction can act as a lens to allow ordinary people, and I want to use that term very advisedly, into those extraordinary worlds.
Oh, I think every person, every ordinary person has this wonderful capacity for thought. Even if they don't use it, every time they go to bed at night and sleep and dream, they're reminded of the richness of what they carry around in their heads. And I'm old-fashioned. I'm interested in God. I'm interested in nothingness. I'm interested in the nature of evil. And I just use these stories, these scientific stories. Of course, I'm interested in them. I mean, I'm fascinated by them, completely obsessed by them. But I am using them as an excuse, because if I wasn't, I wouldn't be doing literature. I'd be doing science journalism. And there's so much of that. And it has a role. And I'm deeply grateful. Like, I could never have written this without the wonderful documentaries from the BBC, you know, by, what's his name? Jim
Al-Khalili.
Yeah, I mean, I first heard about the night in Heligoland that Heisenberg spends in a simple BBC documentary, and still, I think literature does something else, because I would say that, as an Argentine writer said, truth and madness are symptoms of the same disease, and I think that literature really is about that disease.
I got to scroll backwards maybe ever so slightly. I've read you say, and you've alluded to it already, that you're fascinated by those historical facts which are so incredible as to seem unbelievable. I also love those facts. Maybe you could just talk to us briefly about a couple of those. I'm now having a moment where I'm hoping that the one I'm about to ask you out isn't the paragraph of fiction. It's the last night of the Berlin Philharmonic.
Oh, no, that's true. Well,
fantastic.
Yeah, no, and again, no, you have to, I'm very cavalier about these things because of two things. First of all, I live in el culo del mundo, like we say in Chile. Like, I'm at the ass end of the world, okay? I don't have to deal with the pressures of having culture. This country, it's a backwater, and that gives you a great freedom, no? It gives you great freedom. And so I don't have to worry as much about being true or participating in the debates of the first world. But you don't mess with the Holocaust. If you're writing about that period of time, just out of respect, I did hold back. I was like, and because it's so, what happened during those years is so unbelievably dark that you don't need to add anything. So yeah, everything in that text, the Berlin Philharmonic, the strange, what they did to Goering's body, this sort of erasing him from history, that's all true. And I think you have to remain true to that, especially if you're using the register of an essay, which I was. But there are also many things in the book that are, like, for example, Alexander Grothendieck, his life reads like fiction. And I don't think what I did was join two things that are, he had no connection in real life to Shinichi Mochizuki, who is a wonderful and working mathematician. He never met Grothendieck. There's no connection. But Grothendieck's life, you read it and you say, well, this is fake. He didn't really have these delirious nights where he would sing in two voices and communicate. That's true. I mean, at least if you believe his own words, that's true. Because he was a mystic. And I'm interested in the mathematics because of the mysticism that there is. I think there is a profoundly magical aspect to mathematics. And in his life, you see the anecdotes and the things that he did, and they seem otherworldly. Even if you look at it if you Google him, you'll find these pictures where he looks like a better looking Foucault, like a boxer, and then he's dressed he has a massive beard and he's dressed like a monk. And that's all true. He actually retreated from the world and became a monk, and he would eat soup from dandelions that he picked up off the ground, and he almost starved to death, and he let his house burn down in front of him because he was a mystic. He's trying to reach that part of the experience that you have to leave words and common sense behind if you want to get there. And it's not a terrain that many people go into, but to me, it's the most fascinating terrain there is.
It is that thing of, in the book and generally in life, isolation, despair, madness, they seem to be the fate of so many geniuses like the ones that you write about in this book. Do you think that that's inevitable in the stories of those sorts of people, and why?
No, of course not. But fiction demands drama. It's very boring if we have this perfectly stable person who comes up with a wonderful idea and everybody accepts it. No, fiction imposes its form on the world, so it's easy to fall into these. But I do like to find stories that are actually of that have that flavor. That actually, because to me, what I am most interested in is delirium. It's not madness. It's delirium, because what we see in delirium, the things that we can become aware of during delirium, to me, the question is not whether is this real or not. It's what can we see thanks to this? And this applies to everything. That's why I've always said that people should know about quantum mechanics, but they should also know about tarot and the I Ching, because the main question is, what does this show me? What are the blind spots? How far can we see next to this? Is there something? And that is fundamental if we want to step into the future, because we can't really inhabit the future that we have not yet imagined. So I go to these types of stories of the mad genius because I'm interested in the genius, because you can't really, I mean, everybody thinks with other people's thoughts. We all use each other's words. And if you step away from that, it's very easy to be called mad. It's very easy if you leave common sense behind, which, by the way, I think is a wonderful thing. I think if anybody has ever lost their common sense, they'll know if they ever have to go through a period where common sense is something that is beyond them, they will appreciate how the richness of common sense. But there are these men and women who go beyond it, and most of them get lost, and some of them find their way back.
Does the profile of something like the International Booker, does that mean a lot to you as a writer? Does that mean anything to you as a writer?
No, not much. I've never thought that awards mean anything. I not just because I think that well, my favorite books have never won any. I think it's really more of an industry thing. When I got on the long list, let me put it this way: the first people who got in touch with me were my editors, and then the media, and after that, my family and friends, and that's really it. It's a circus. It doesn't matter. It adds nothing to a book. You have to. Being a writer requires. This is not to sit alone. This is a monk-like thing. You sit alone. You don't have. Well, unless you're working in the industry, there's no big parties to go to. There's no good-looking people to talk to. You're sitting by yourself. So you have to find, if you're going to write, you have to find a sense of self-worth. Even if it makes you say stupid things like I've just said, where you say, well, the Booker is not that important, because I realize that it's very important. But it's not very important to me. It's very important to other people. And even if, I mean, I can't help but think that it's just, people say the Booker Prize or the National Book Award or whatever. It's just 5 people who are reading books and saying, this one's good. I cannot see it any other way. And because I usually like books that not many other people do, or that, well, I'll take it with a pinch of salt and ignore it, no? I think that's the best way to do it. It's not a popularity contest, especially literature. Who cares about books, really? If you want to win an award, there's this line in Hitchhiker's Guide from the Galaxy where I think it's Ford Prefect. He meets this American and the guy says, have fun, win awards. And that just stuck in my head. I read it when I was about 10 or something. Have fun, win awards. That's how people think about things nowadays.
I think you and I have so many similar cultural touchstones. In a slightly similar vein, did it mean anything when Barack Obama put you on a list and said that he liked what you'd written?
Well, objectively, it meant that he basically made me famous in my own country with a tweet, because I was on covers of newspapers. No, every single news outlet in Chile contacted me, because if you're a small country and Barack Obama mentions you, but I said no to all those interviews. I just said, and I still haven't given a single interview where when they said, I want to talk about being on the short list, or I want to talk about the Obama thing. When did we start caring what ex-presidents read? I like Obama. He's the best. He's the best. But when did we really start caring about what politicians read? I take the measure of success, like I said before, is getting an email from Adam Curtis. A cup of tea with Curtis means a lot more to me than Barack Obama's reading list. And I know I sound like a fool, but I didn't get into this for money or for fame or for recognition, because I would have done something else. I would have played football.
In which case, I'm going to move on swiftly from being that person who has asked you about Barack Obama. In terms of translation, it's becoming a discipline that thankfully is starting to get the sort of credit it deserves, certainly here and in the United Kingdom as well. How did it work for you when it came to the English language translation of this book? Even, I mean, the original title, Un Verdor Terrible, A Terrible Greenery, I think is my terrible English language translation of that, but it's obviously radically different to what the book title then becomes.
Well, it's not terrible. It's not your fault. There was no way to translate it. We tried. I worked on it for a long time. I worked with Adrian Nathan West, and we couldn't find a translation. There's no way. There was no good way to do it, proper way to do it. And it has several titles. In German, it's called The Blind Light. In France, it's called The Blinding Lights. And perhaps that speaks to the problems of translation, but also to the wealth of the book, because it does try to speak about those things, you know. And the translation was a joy. I've always wanted to write in English, but it made no sense. If I wasn't going to write an English text here in Chile. It was silly, no. But I did write the final text of the book, The Night Gardener. I wrote that directly in English. I had to translate it to Spanish. And I worked with Nathan line by line on it. Because I enjoy English so much. Everything I've written since then has been in English. I have a book now out in Spain and in Italy, and they're translated from English. And my new book, the one I'm working on now, is also written in English. It's just, to me, it's natural. It's like a mother tongue. Even if they're gonna say, well, he was a better writer in Spanish, I just enjoy it. I just enjoy it a lot. And my big problem now is that I have to translate them back into Spanish, and there's nothing worse than reading your own work. I mean, it's going to be torture.
Maybe just tell me a little about The Night Gardener as well, because throughout the book, you obviously focus on real people, real characters, true stories. The Night Gardener then comes at the end. Why create him for that piece at the end?
I actually wrote that because I hated the idea of a book launch. I hated the idea of having to do what we're doing now. I'm getting used to it after all the interviews. So I wrote that text as something meant to be read during the launch of the book. And the first edition, which came out in Germany, doesn't have The Night Gardener in it, because I was going to go to Europe before the pandemic started. And I said, what am I going to do? I've published 2 books before that, and there's only been 1 launch, because I don't like book launches. It's really boring to listen to someone talk about a book you haven't read. And I had made a fool of myself, and my friends had made a lot of fun that laughed at me. So I said, well, I'm going to write a text and I'm going to read it. And when I finished it, I said, well, this would make the book even weirder. Let's just stick it at the back.
That's not the answer I was expecting, but it's a fantastic one, nonetheless.
No, it's true. It's not very charismatic, but it's true.
Maybe I can finish with you by asking a little bit about what you're writing at the moment and what happens next, or if you can tell us anything about that.
Well, I finished a very short book for Adelphi, which is the most wonderful publisher in the world. They're from Italy. They're Roberto Calasso. If anybody hasn't read him, they should go out and find him. Roberto Calasso is one of the best Italian writers, and he died this year. It was terribly sad. And so there's this very short book. It's just 2 essays. They're sort of conjoined. And it's a meditation on how unbelievable reality is becoming. On the fact that there is now a strange paranoia that seems to be affecting everyone, not just people who are in the madhouse, but also your aunts and uncles and your best friends and everybody, us, probably the both of us included. And it's called The Stone of Madness. It talks about that painting by Hieronymus Bosch. And that just came out and the next one, the big one, is it's a book about intelligence. It's a book about the person I consider to be the smartest human being of the 20th century, because I really think that he's coming back into the world right now, perhaps through technology. There's a sense of him, you know, where this person died, and there's a sort of reflux that's bringing him back. So that's what the book is about. I'm not going to say anything else because my agent to me.
I understand that completely. It has been absolutely wonderful talking to you today from your home in Chile. The book is one of the best things I've read this year, and I've been saying that loudly and frequently to anybody who will listen to me. The book is When We Cease to Understand the World. It's out on Pushkin Press, and Benjamin Labatut, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you so much, Rick. And thank you for the Dublin Festival.
And don't forget, you can check out the Dublin Book Festival website for more events that are all happening during the week. And thanks for joining us.